It's crazy, right? Like over 4 billion people voting in elections globally just this year.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a huge chunk of humanity, weighing in on how they want their world run. And in all that change, there's this one relationship we keep coming back to. The U.S. and China,
Yeah,
like we know it's important, right? But figuring it out, that's what we're doing today.
definitely.
You sent over some really interesting stuff, especially from China's point of view, with the possibility of Trump coming back.
Oh, yeah, that adds a whole other layer to things.
Definitely. And we've got these pieces from the Doha Forum where Victor Gay, this expert on all things China, lays out their thinking.
He's a great source. Really insightful.
Okay, so ready for a curveball. One of the things that really struck me was this idea about the tariffs, the ones Trump put in place.
Right.
It might actually be hurting American consumers more than China.
Interesting.
Yeah, and a totally different topic.
Yeah.
China's kind of quietly become this global peacemaker. They even helped with that deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Wow, a lot of people in the West didn't see that coming.
Definitely. So for this deep dive, let's try to get inside China's head. How do they see the U.S.? Where's all the global power shifting? And what does it mean for us down the road?
It's the right time to be asking these questions. I think we're seeing the world order change right in front of us.
Yeah, and when it comes to the economy, that shift is pretty huge. China's on track to be the world's biggest economy, maybe as soon as 2030 or by 2035 at the latest.
Wow.
Even Elon Musk, the rockets and electric cars guy, he's saying China's economy could be twice the size of the U.S. by like the middle of the century.
Wow.
Yeah, and those aren't just numbers. Those are like earthquake-level changes.
Yeah, for sure. But economic size is just one piece of the puzzle. Victor Guy argues that the real rivalry is about ideology, how each country sees its role in the world and how they use their power.
Right, it's not just about who's got the most money, but how they use it.
Exactly. And if these two different approaches aren't handled carefully well, it could lead to conflict.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not just about having the biggest economy, but how you use it right. And that brings us back to those tariffs. In that Doha Forum piece, Victor Gao is basically saying tariffs are just a tax on American consumers.
That's a tough one.
What do you think? Are they actually stopping China's growth, or are they just making things harder for Americans?
It's complicated for sure. We're all feeling the pressure of inflation and everything feeling shaky, So are these tariffs actually good for the U.S. in the long run, or are they just adding to all that stress people are already feeling? It makes you question the tools we're using in this whole economic competition.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to trip up your opponent, but you end up tripping over yourself.
Exactly.
And then there's this whole other side of things. China's getting involved in global diplomacy.
Yeah.
I was really surprised by that Iran-Saudi Arabia deal. I mean, that was them stepping way outside their usual box.
Yeah. It's a definite sign that China's foreign policy is changing. They're not happy just sitting back anymore. They want to shape things globally. And the U.S., they've got their attention pulled in a lot of different directions these days.
Right.
So that creates an opening, and China's more than ready to fill it.
So they're definitely getting more assertive globally, and not everyone knows what to make of that. Now, with the Russia-Ukraine thing, China's stance has been confusing to a lot of people. Victor Gateklub points out they've been consistently calling for peace, focusing on dialogue and trying to de-escalate things.
It's a delicate balancing act for them, for sure.
What do you think their end game is there?
Well, they're trying to keep everyone happy and not get dragged into a fight that doesn't really help them, This really shows how messy things are in a world where everyone wants to be in charge. Each move has to be carefully planned.
Yeah. And speaking of messy, the Middle East is still a tinderbox.
Yeah.
With the Hamas attack on Israel and everything escalating, Victor Gay is really worried about the rising death toll, especially among Palestinian civilians.
Heartbreaking situation.
It is. And it makes you think how important it is to find some kind of lasting solution to this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. China's always supported that two-state solution idea. But Victor Gass isn't happy with the U.S. approach. He's saying that just supporting Israel no matter what might not actually bring peace.
Right. It's important to look at all sides.
Definitely. He brings up a really important question. Can you really just ignore what the Palestinians want and expect things to calm down in the region?
It's something to think about.
Then there's the whole BRICS thing. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they've been in the news a lot lately, especially with them adding new countries like the UAE. Are they a real threat to the U.S. running the world's economy? With all this talk about the dollar losing its power.
BRICS is definitely gaining steam, but I wouldn't say it's a direct attack on the U.S. It's more like they're reacting to how the U.S. seems to use the dollar and the SWIFT system as weapons, Victor Ga's point is that the U.S. could calm things down by promising not to use those tools for political reasons.
So it's like saying, let's play fair and everyone wins. Okay, and of course we can't ignore the big one, Taiwan and Hong Kong. There's a lot of worry in the U.S. about keeping Taiwan free and democratic, but that goes right against how China feels about their territory.
It's a tough spot for sure.
Yeah. Victor Ga has a really interesting take on this. He says it's important to keep Taiwan the way it is, not just for Taiwan, but for all of China. He even suggests making Taiwan a free trade zone.
That's a new one.
Yeah. He thinks that could help the U.S. feel better about those semiconductor supply chains and maybe lower the tension with China a bit.
Interesting.
But then he doesn't hold back. He says straight up, if a U.S. president officially recognizes Taiwan, it would mean cutting off all ties with China. Talk about high stakes.
Wow. Yeah, things could get really serious really fast.
Okay, so to sum up what we've talked about so far, China feels like the U.S. is trying to hold them back. The U.S. is nervous about China getting more powerful, and they're both looking at each other with serious suspicion. That's a recipe for trouble on a global level. What's really stuck with you from all this?
It's a lot to take in, but what really gets me thinking is this. If both the U.S. and China really want a stable world, like they say, how do they get past all this distrust and actually work together on the stuff we all have to deal with?
Right.
I mean, climate change, pandemics, economic craziness, those need everyone on board, not just one country.
Right. It's not just about them. It affects everything, alliances, global trade, even how countries are run.
Exactly. The relationship between the U.S. and China is shaping the 21st century. Understanding it is crucial if we want to handle the challenges and grab the opportunities coming our way.
It's like we're all on this ship called Earth, and the U.S. and China are two of the captains. Where they take us will have a huge impact on all of us, whether we realize it or not.
Powerful image.
It is, and it makes you realize how important it is to be informed and involved citizens. We need to understand what's happening out there, participate in real conversations, and make sure our leaders are making decisions that put peace and working together first.
We can't just sit back and watch.
Right? It's not about being passive. It's about knowing that we're all part of this and we need to speak up.
And that starts with understanding where everyone's coming from, including China.
Which is why this whole deep dive is so important. It gives us a peek into how China sees the world, their goals, and their worries.
Exactly. Even with all this competition, there's always room for talking diplomacy and finding common ground.
That's a message I think we could all use a reminder of. But I'm curious, you've given us this really nuanced picture of this whole U.S.-China thing. What are some things they could actually do to cool things down and start working together more?
It's not easy, that's for sure. But a good place to start would be to set up better ways to talk to each other. Right now, there's so much mistrust and misunderstanding about what each side is doing that can easily lead to mistakes and things escalating.
Yeah, they need to actually talk to each other, not just about each other.
Right. Building trust and being open with each other, that's key. That could mean high-level meetings, regular talks between diplomats, even stuff that helps people in both countries understand each other's cultures.
Building bridges, not walls, right?
Exactly. And there are things they could work on together where everyone benefits. Climate change is a perfect example. They both know how dangerous a warming planet is. Working together could lead to way better solutions than either one could come up with alone.
They could share technology, work together on policies, even invest in clean energy projects together.
Exactly. It's not about ignoring the areas where they compete, but about figuring out how to handle those differences while also tackling the problems they both face.
Finding that balance between competition and cooperation.
Right. It won't be easy. There'll be disagreements and tense moments. But the alternative, letting things get out of control, is just too dangerous to even think about.
Yeah. We're talking about the future of the planet here.
And billions of lives.
So with everything we've talked about, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. The U.S.-China relationship is the biggest geopolitical challenge we face today. It's complicated, it's always changing, and it will have a huge impact on all of us. So we need to be informed, engaged, and willing to think critically about the choices we make both as individuals and as a society.
It's a reminder that we can't afford to just sit back and watch. The stakes are too high.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep looking for solutions.
You've given us a lot to think about. Before we move on, there's one more piece of the puzzle. I want to explore the role of ideology. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth digging a little deeper.
Absolutely. At the heart of this rivalry is a clash of values, a fundamental difference in how the U.S. and China see the world and their place in it.
So it's not just about power and interests, but their core beliefs.
Exactly. And those differences are deeply rooted in their histories, their cultures, their political systems. It's like they're speaking different languages even when they're using the same words.
Let's break those differences down a bit. What are the main ideological principles that shape how each country sees the world?
For the U.S., it's really about liberal democracy, individual rights, the rule of law. These values have been at the core of America since its founding, and they still guide U.S. foreign policy today.
It's about spreading democracy, promoting human rights, and upholding a rules-based international order.
Exactly. And that's where the tension with China comes in. China's ideology is built on a very different set of principles. It's about state power, national unity, social harmony. Individual rights often come second to the needs of the group, and the rule of law can sometimes take a backseat to what the Communist Party wants.
So a more authoritarian collectivist model focused on stability and control.
Exactly. And this creates a fundamental clash of values. From the U.S. perspective, China's system is repressive, undemocratic, and a threat to the liberal world order.
And from China's perspective, the U.S. is trying to push its values on everyone else, undermining China's sovereignty and meddling in their internal affairs.
Exactly. So it's not just about competing interests, but competing visions of what a fair and successful world should look like.
Which makes finding common ground even harder.
Absolutely. These ideological differences are deeply ingrained, and they influence how each side sees the other's actions and intentions. It's like they're looking at the same world through different lenses, and they see completely different things.
So how do we deal with this clash of ideologies? Is peaceful coexistence even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with admitting that these differences are real and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. We can't just ignore them or pretend they don't matter.
No burying our heads in the sand.
Exactly. We need to be honest about the challenges, but we also need to be open to finding ways to manage those differences peacefully and productively.
So it's about finding a way to live together in a world where we don't always agree on everything?
Right, and that takes a certain level of tolerance, empathy, and a willingness to see the world from different points of view. It's about recognizing that there are different ways of being in the world, different ways of organizing society, different ways of defining success.
And that diversity of perspectives can actually be a good thing, not a bad thing, if we approach it the right way.
Absolutely. It's about finding ways to learn from each other, to cooperate where our interests line up, and to compete fairly and respectfully where they don't.
Wise words. This conversation has given us a lot to think about, and I think we need to pause here for a moment and let it all sink in.
I agree. This is a topic we could talk about for hours, and we've only just scratched the surface.
We'll be back in a moment to continue this deep dive and explore some potential paths forward. Stay tuned.
You know, when we talk about these different worldviews, it's important to remember they're not just ideas. They have a real impact on how these two global giants interact.
Yeah, it's like those differences are these invisible forces shaping everything, like from trade deals to military moves.
Right. And those forces are always there. Take human rights, for example. The U.S. is constantly criticizing China's record on that, pointing to things like how they treat Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang or the crackdown on pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong.
And China really pushes back against that. They see it as the West butting into their business. And they often say the U.S. is being hypocritical, bringing up America's own problems with social justice.
Yeah, China says their way of doing things, putting economic growth and stability first, fits their culture and history better. They see their approach to human rights as fitting their unique situation. It's a clash of perspectives that makes it really tough to find common ground.
It's like they're talking past each other, each side judging the other based on their own beliefs.
Exactly. And you see this in so many areas of the U.S.-China relationship, from trade wars to those arguments over territory in the South China Sea. It's like trying to solve a puzzle when you don't even speak the same language.
Sounds super frustrating. But with all this talk of rivalry and competition, are there any areas where the U.S. and China actually agree? Are there any shared interests that could maybe help bridge that gap?
There are a few spots where their interests line up, although those often get lost in all the disagreements. Climate change is a big one. Both countries get how serious a warming planet is, and there have been times they've worked together on it.
Right, like that agreement to phase out HFCs a few years back, those super powerful greenhouse gases, that felt like a good sign that even with all the tension, they can still find ways to work together on things that affect everyone.
Exactly. And there's definitely room for more teamwork in things like renewable energy, carbon capture technology, and investing in infrastructure that's built to last.
It's like even if you're rivals, you got to work together to put out a fire if it's going to burn down the house you both live in.
Good way to put it. Another area where they could work together is global health. The COVID pandemic really showed how connected the world is and how important it is for countries to team up on health threats that cross borders.
That virus didn't care about borders or politics. It was a wake-up call that some problems need everyone working together.
Absolutely. And while there was a lot of blaming going on during the pandemic, there was also this realization that working together on things like vaccines, tracking diseases, and making sure healthcare systems are strong is good for everyone.
So even if you're competing like crazy in some areas, you still got to make sure the hospitals work and people get the care they need. It seems like the U.S.-China relationship isn't so black and white. It's not just friend or enemy. It's more like this tangled web of competition and cooperation, shared interest, and those deep ideological differences we talked about.
Right, it's always changing, full of risks and opportunities, and that's what makes it so interesting to study and so important to understand.
Like watching a high-stakes chess game, but the board is the whole world, and the outcome affects everyone.
Exactly.
Speaking of the future, what do you think will happen with this relationship? Is this rivalry going to turn into a real conflict? Or is there a chance for a more stable and cooperative future between the U.S. and China?
Tough question. If I knew the answer, I'd be a fortune teller. But if I had to guess, I'd say we'll probably see continued competition with some cooperation and some conflict mixed in. Some people call it competitive coexistence.
So sometimes they'll fight, sometimes they'll find common ground, and sometimes they'll just agree to disagree.
Right? I think the key to making this work is figuring out how to compete peacefully and responsibly without things spiraling out of control.
Like walking a tightrope. You got to stay balanced and make sure you don't fall into open conflict.
Good analogy. It's going to take clear communication, a willingness to compromise sometimes, and knowing that there are some lines neither side can cross.
Sounds like diplomacy is going to be more important than ever.
For sure, diplomacy plus a healthy dose of pragmatism and remembering that we live in a world where everyone's connected. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
So the big question is, can the U.S. and China figure out a way to live together peacefully and productively in a world that's getting more complicated and connected all the time?
That's the challenge, and it's one that will define the 21st century. There are no easy answers, no guarantees, but I do think that with smart leadership and a commitment to open and honest dialogue, a more stable and cooperative future is possible.
That's hopeful. And it reminds us that we all have a role to play in building that future.
It's not just about what happens in government offices and meeting rooms. It's also about the choices we make as individuals, as consumers, as citizens. We can all help build a more peaceful and prosperous world.
And that starts with understanding how this relationship works, engaging in thoughtful conversations, and pushing for policies that put cooperation ahead of conflict.
Well said.
This deep dive has been like a crash course on one of the most important relationships in the world. And while we've covered a lot, we've really just scratched the surface.
Definitely. There's so much more to explore, so many nuances to unpack, but I think we've laid a good foundation for understanding how complex this relationship really is.
We have. And for me, one of the key takeaways is that this isn't a simple story with easy solutions.
Yeah.
There are no quick fixes, no magic answers. This is going to take careful thought, strategic planning, and a willingness to have some tough conversations.
You're right. And it's going to take both sides to move past those simplistic us versus them stories and see that there are shared interests and that we're all connected.
It's not about pretending the differences aren't there or that the competition doesn't matter. It's about finding ways to handle those differences in a way that works and to cooperate where we can, even while knowing that there will be times when our interests don't align.
Exactly. And that's where diplomacy is so important. It's about building bridges, having conversations, and creating space for understanding and compromise. It's about recognizing that in the 21st century, global problems need global solutions, and no one country can do it alone.
It's a tough job, but it's crucial for the future we're building together.
And it's a future we all have a responsibility to shape.
This conversation has been really eye-opening, and I'm sure it's raised a lot of questions for our listeners. But we're running out of time for today.
I agree. We could easily keep talking for another hour, but we need to wrap things up for now.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. This relationship between the U.S. and China, it's not just about geopolitics or economics. It's about people. It's about the billions of lives that are affected by the decisions these two countries make. It's about the future we're all creating together.
A powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping that future.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage our listeners to keep digging into this topic. Read articles, listen to podcasts, talk to people, and don't be afraid to question your own assumptions and biases. The more we understand about this relationship, the better prepared we'll be to handle the challenges and opportunities that are coming our way.
Well said.
And remember, this isn't just about two countries. It's about the world we all share.
Let's make it a world worth sharing.
That's a perfect thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we've gone from opium wars to like a tech Cold War in just a couple hundred years.
Yeah, it's amazing how much history is packed in there. And I think understanding those historical tensions helps us make sense of everything that's happening now. Like China's economic boom in recent decades, a lot of people see that as them reclaiming their rightful place on the world stage after years of, being held back.
Right. It's like they're taking back their power and influence after being pushed around by the West for so long.
That's definitely a feeling you hear a lot in China. And it fuels their ambitions to be a global leader, not just in economics, but in politics and military power, too. Which, of course, makes the U.S. nervous. They've been used to being the top dog for decades.
It's like this power shift is happening right in front of us, and neither side really knows what to do about it.
Exactly. And that uncertainty creates mistrust and suspicion, which makes it even harder to find common ground.
So where do we go from here? How do we handle this relationship in a way that's good for both countries and the whole world?
I think the first thing is realizing that we can't go back to the old way of doing things. China is a major player now, and that's not going to change. The U.S. needs to adjust to this new reality and find ways to work with China constructively, even while accepting their differences and competing when they have to.
So it's not about trying to stop China's rise or make them change their system. It's about finding a way to live peacefully and productively together, even though we have different values and goals.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between competition and cooperation. It's about setting clear rules that everyone can agree on, even while they're still competing in some areas. It's about building trust through talking and diplomacy while staying realistic about the challenges ahead.
That sounds really difficult, especially with all the distrust between them right now.
It is, but I don't think it's impossible. There are areas where their interests match up, like climate change and global health, where they've shown they can work together. And there are other areas where they might be able to find common ground if both sides are willing to try.
It's like they're both climbing a mountain. Each one wants to reach the top first,
Mm-mm.
but they also realize they need to help each other along the way or they could both fall off a cliff.
That's a great way to put it. They might be rivals, but they're also partners in a way because they both have to deal with these global problems that no single country can handle alone.
What about us regular people? What can we do? It feels kind of overwhelming. Like how can one person make a difference in something as big as this U.S.-China relationship?
It's easy to feel helpless when you think about these global forces, but I really believe that people have a big role to play. It starts with being informed. Read about the issues, listen to different opinions, and talk to people who see things differently.
So no hiding from the problem.
Right. The more we understand this relationship, the better we can hold our leaders accountable and push for policies that focus on peace and working together. We can talk to our elected officials, support groups that are trying to build connections between the two countries, even choose to buy from companies that are doing business in an ethical and sustainable way.
So it's not just about governments and diplomats. It's about all of us making smart choices and speaking up for a more peaceful and successful world.
Exactly. The future of this relationship and the future of our planet depends on it.
You've given us so much to think about. This deep dive has been like a crash course on one of the most important relationships in the world. And while we've learned a lot, we've really just scratched the surface.
I agree. It's something that deserves our attention and careful thought.
Before we wrap up, is there one last thing you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the future isn't set in stone. The relationship between the U.S. and China is still changing, and the choices they make, the choices we all make, will affect the world for generations to come.
It's a powerful thought. We all have a part in shaping the future. And that future, while it's uncertain, is full of both challenges and exciting possibilities. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating and ever-changing world of U.S.-China relations. We hope you'll keep exploring this topic and talking about the choices ahead. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.